In the beginning, there was no bay. There was no Golden Gate. It was a valley, ringed by hills and mountains, greened by innumerable creeks, and watered by a huge river that gathered the runoff of half of what is now California. The ocean was 30 miles to the west, beyond some hills we now call the Farallon Islands. With the end of the Ice Age, the ocean rose and slowly began to fill that valley. The people living here at the time, 8,000 or 10,000 years ago, watched it happen. Eventually, what had once been a huge inland valley became an expansive bay. A tidal marsh formed along its edges, attracting an abundance of fish and birds. People resettled near the bay, using the marsh to hunt and fish, with a sacred gathering place nearby called Tole Lake.
Tole Lake was one of the most sacred healing places in the Western Hemisphere. And the people who took care of that lived on the creek just below the lake that fed the marsh here. The Alaguali people were people on top of the reeds, people on top of the marsh. They took care of the marsh. And we always understood that health of the water, the health of the land, was indicative of the health of the people. When the Spanish came, they marched the people from Alaguali out of here into the missions.
And so villages along the marsh edge and elsewhere were emptied by the Spanish. The missionaries introduced ranching, and European crops took root in what they now called Alta California. By the mid-19th century, the pace of change quickened with the American takeover of California and the gold rush. The discovery of gold in 1848 in the distant Sierra Nevada range rippled through the bay. Hydraulic mining washed enormous amounts of sediment into the bay, raising the bottom by 3 feet. Settlers and miners poured into San Francisco. The other big event was the Bear Flag Revolt and annexation of California by the U.S. in 1846. Mexican land grants were then cast aside. The uplands were claimed first, but the Federal Swampland Reclamation Act rewarded those who drained and converted the marshes to productive farmland.
Of course, the reason it was reclaimed in the first place was, if you would alleviate the government from this terrible mosquito problem out here, you could reclaim this land, start paying some taxes on your income, and produce a usable product out here. So it was like a win-win situation. So that was how most of these ranches got the enticement to be formed. I've heard that the levees at the time were not very tall at all. They didn't need very much levees. They could drain the whole ranch with floodgates. Over time, as the ground got dried and it shrunk down a little bit, and I guess wind erosion, the land subsided, and now we have to use pumps and physically remove it from the ranch.
But there weren't many people down there. There wasn't really anybody who lived down there permanently, except like the bridge tender.
You look at down the ranch, you have that constant wind, you got mosquitoes, whatever water is there, sure, not very good. So there wasn't a lot of people. You're talking a handful of people.
And they would plow up disc and plant seeds and eventually harvest a crop. A lot of it went out by barge. The Jones Ranch had 2 or 3 docks, and they would bring the hay bales, and barges would come up and they'd barge it away. Every day when I was a kid, an egg boat would go down from Petaluma loaded with eggs to San Francisco, and then they would turn around and they'd bring up hay and grain feeds for the mills in Petaluma. That was a very busy trade at the time. By the time I became aware, everything went out by railroad.
The isolation of the drained wetlands also attracted the attention of the United States Navy, who in 1941 built a secretive, secure, and self-contained naval base.
Skaggs Island, that was top security. It was very high-tech stuff. Both entrances had a guard sitting there 24 hours a day. When you come on the property or off the property, you'd have to get checked in and everything else. They would deny entry to people that aren't supposed to be there. It's pretty well known now that that was a listening post to listening to the communications going on back and forth between China and Russia or wherever else. I had a bunch of friends because all the kids from Skaggs Island went to school with me. The Sonoma public schools there, Sonoma High, Crestwood Elementary. And they said that they had a very nice little establishment out there. Skaggs Island had their own little bowling alley. They had a swimming pool. They had a movie theater, gas station, general store, pretty much everything you need.
It was dryland farming. They didn't have irrigation, so you had your one crop a year, and you had to make it on your one crop. So it was a marginal operation.
And that thing about that marsh, when you had the right rains, you'd have hay that's 5 feet tall. It was just incredible. Yeah, the production was just amazing.
Down here in the marsh, we have so much moisture coming off the bay and just the cool climate. At night it gets cold, the fog comes in very often. I've had some stuff that's been down 3.5 weeks and still isn't really dry enough to bale.
Agriculture has changed and diversified over the years. Cattle grazing, vineyards, and dairies all are present in and adjacent to the marsh. Many different crops have been experimented with, including different types of beans and even safflower, but oat hay has remained throughout the years.
I mean, you line up all the critters on the side of the levee here and ask them, what we should do. They'd say, well, you can just go away, just leave. We enough of you humans around, leave. We did a good job before you arrived.
Conversion to agriculture and urban development were two ways that habitat for fish and wildlife has been reduced in the Baylands. All around the bay, 190,000 acres of tidal marsh were reduced to 40,000 acres, an 80% reduction. Over time, we've recognized the value of marshes and the effects of losing them. Thanks to the wise stewardship of local farmers and thoughtful planning, these lands remain open and undeveloped and connected to the adjacent hills.
Nowadays, we have endangered species, and I don't want to harm any endangered species. And there's the interests of the fish out there. We don't want to harm the habitat for the fish.
Starting in the 1960s, restoration of the land back to wetlands began. Since this time, thousands of acres along Highway 37 have been restored to marsh. These efforts not only create wildlife habitat and filter runoff that enters the bay, but may also be our best answer in the face of climate change. Wetlands are the single best habitat on the planet for sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. The restoration work we do now will buffer our more populated areas from sea level rise, and as the weather becomes more extreme, provide a place for floodwaters to go. The story of the Baylands is one of change. Not only has the landscape undergone continual changes, but so have the people and our perspectives. Over time, the marsh has been known as a generous provider for the Alaguali people, and then as an impediment to progress for European settlers. Drained and claimed, it became productive farmland, a thoroughfare between metropolises, home to isolated communities, and even a top-secret naval base. Today, farmers on the Baylands are continuing a legacy that began over a century ago. But farming is becoming increasingly more challenging due to the protections for endangered species and the difficulty of maintaining the levee system while the land continues to sink. Wetland restoration will continue to coexist with farming and ranching, and together, we will imagine and create a future that includes productive farms and ranches, healthy marshes, and a place for people to discover the timeless beauty of this ever-changing landscape.